Welcome to Quilt Addicts Anonymous. I'm Stephanie Soebbing. Today we're going to be working through the patterns in my book, Simple Quilts for the Modern Home. Today we're going to be doing the pattern Ripples. We're doing a new pattern in the book each month for a year to celebrate the release of the book. And all of the cutting instructions and your fabric requirements and your assembly diagrams, all those step-by-step instructions are in the book. So make sure you go pick up your copy. You can get it at your local quilt shop or from us over at shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com. If you order it from us, I of course will sign and personalize your book for you before it goes in the mail. I really like this one as it's a really easy introduction into half square triangles, sewing them, then the two at a time method, which I really love. And it's bigger piecing, and you can really have fun with your fabrics in this to really create a graphic element as it goes out. This one has an alternate grid setting, which is really common in the modern quilting movement. So that way the focal point isn't dead center in your quilt, it's more on the left middle in this case. And we play around with where that focal point is at various points in this book, and it's really fun. So I'm going to show you how to do a half square triangle using the two at a time method. And it's really great because I find that I can get really accurate piecing doing this because you're always starting a little bit bigger and then trimming down to size later. And I'll show you my tips and tricks to make sure that all those points end up right where they're supposed to be. And then also I'm going to show you how I assemble my rows so that way you don't lose your points after you spent all that time trimming everything so that it was nice and perfect before you got sewing your rows together. Let's get started. So the original fabric that I used for Ripples, not all of it is available anymore. So unfortunately, we're not able to kit this one. When you do a book, a lot of times you're making the quilts 2 years before they ever see it in the public. So unfortunately, that fabric is no longer available. So instead, I am using Mirage by QT Fabrics, and then also using it with the Pixie Dot Basics from Ink and Arrow. They really play nice together, and I really like this line. It's really bright, fun, very spring and summery. So if you're planning on getting to this right now, this is a good one to do. But I also really like that we're going to be making it in different colors for this video tutorial because it shows you that you don't have to stick with the original color palette. This is very different than that original earthy colors that I used, and it's still going to look fabulous when it's done. So let's get started. So you can see I've actually already drawn my line from point to point, but I'm just going to do it one more time so you guys can see it here. I got a little excited when I was prepping for the video for this one. So what I'm doing is I am just lining up my ruler so that it's even with the points of both of these here because I want it to be going even with all those points. And then I usually start in the center and work my way out. This is a bias that we're marking across, so sometimes that fabric can stretch a little bit on you, which can be a good thing. It can also be a bad thing. But I find that if you work from the center out, then your fabric is less likely to shift as you're working with it. And that way you can mark right into that point. And so you've got a nice guide to follow there. Set this to the side for now. And just a note, this is kind of a bigger square that we're going to be trimming to. So I would definitely recommend using the 12.5-inch ruler for this. When I first started quilting, I had a 6.5-inch ruler, square ruler, a 12.5-inch square ruler, and a 6x24-inch ruler. That was all I needed for a very long time, and it worked real well for me. So now I'm going to layer these right sides together, and I'm going to line up my points. Now these were just cut, so they should be the exact same size here. If there isn't, then something probably went wrong in your cutting stage, so check that out and remeasure. But I'm lining up my points here, and then I'm just going to pin across that line I drew at the top and across the line I drew at the bottom, making sure those points are nice and even. Now I sometimes see people pin here, and that really doesn't do you any good. You really have to pin where you're going to be sewing, otherwise it might be shifted way out of where it's supposed to be when it comes time to sew. So what we're going to do is we're going to sew a scant 1/4 inch seam down both sides of this drawn line. So we're going to come down one side and we're going to go back down the other. And basically what we're going to do is normally when we have our 1/4 inch seam, we line it up with the edge of our fabric. Here we're going to line up the edge of that presser foot with that drawn line as we go through, and we'll show you that in a close-up on the machine so you can kind of see what that looks like. But it really works really well because you're able to get really great piecing, and then when you open it up, you end up getting a 2-for-1 deal on your half square triangles. So I'm setting my sewing machine up to sew a regular 1/4 inch stitch. So now my needle is exactly a 1/4 inch away from the edge of that presser foot. Now whenever I'm doing half square triangles like this, I really like to sew a scant 1/4 inch seam. So on my machine, all I have to do is hit a button and my needle moves one position to the right so that I get a little bit teenier seam. So check your owner's manual, see if that works for you. Otherwise, just play around with some sample pieces to see where you need to be in order to get your finished pieces being the correct size. All right, so now I'm lining it up so that this line that we have here is nice and even with the edge of this presser foot. So again, normally our edge of our fabric is even with the edge of this presser foot, but we're gonna pretend that that line is the edge of the fabric, and we're gonna sew a scant 1/4 inch seam next to that. I'm gonna go ahead and remove that pin now that I've got everything underneath there. And now I'm coming down to the bottom. Now, a lot of times when I see people do this in person, the corners are where they tend to kind of get off a little bit with their accuracy of their 1/4 inch seam. And then what happens is you end up with a frowny or a smiley face instead of a nice straight line across your half square triangle. And it makes it really hard to trim it properly. So what I do in order to make sure that I have a nice accurate 1/4 inch seam is when I get to the point where I can no longer hold this tip of fabric here, I just put my finger right to the side of it, and then just use that to guide it and keep it in place as I sew off the fabric. Now, if you are doing a bunch of these at once, which I recommend that you do, you should just chain piece them and you can feed one right after another into the sewing machine. I'm just doing one for this video tutorial, so I'm gonna go ahead and lift up my presser foot. And now we're just gonna sew right down the other side. I didn't even have to cut thread. I can just flip it around and go. And it saves a ton of time, ton of thread, and it just goes. So now I'm sewing down the other side of this line. I've already sewn down on this side. Now we got to go over here. I still have that edge of the presser foot lined up with that line that I drew. All right, hold that as it goes down so that way you maintain that consistent 1/4 inch seam. Now I'm gonna cut my threads and it's time to reveal our half square triangles. So I'll flip it over in just a second here, but you can see I've got really consistent seams here. And if I measure it, if I place the edge of my ruler on the first seam, I should be just under 1/2 inch, which I am here. And let's look at it on the other side because I think that that white thread might show up a little bit more there, which it kind of does. So we'll measure it over here too. You can see here, we're really nice. We've got exactly just a little bit less than 1/2 inch, which is good. It means you're gonna have plenty when we go to square everything up. Now when you go to cut this apart, you wanna line the edge of your ruler up with that line that we drew. And it doesn't matter if you're exactly on the line when you cut it apart, but you don't wanna be too close to either one of those seams. If you have an 1/8 of an inch stitch or less by the time you cut this apart, then you are gonna have issues where your seam could pop open with use or with quilting if you get it long armed, which is not good. We don't wanna have that happen. So what I'm doing is I am just going straight down the center there as much as I can. And if I'm a little off here or there, it's not the end of the world because we already have our accuracy from when we sewed. But again, you don't want to have too tiny of a seam in between these from your cutting. So now here comes the fun part where we get to turn this into 2 separate half square triangles. So I'm going to lay this with the wrong side up and then I just open up that seam right there. I like to press all my seams open when I'm doing triangles especially because I find that you get really flat points, which makes it a lot easier to put your quilt together. And then also you have a lot more options when it comes to quilting because you're not looking to break a needle when you're trying to get into a seam. So I know I just kind of whipped through that one, so I'm going to slow it down and show you how I press those seams open. So it can be a little tricky at first, but it is so worth it to get the hang of it. So what I do is I just kind of open the seam up a little bit here. Then I put the nose of my iron right down the center, and then I'm holding all 4 of these fingers down, kind of finger pressing the seam open ahead. And I usually go a little bit faster than this, but when you're getting started, feel free to go nice and slow. Just make sure you keep your fingers out of the way of the iron. And when you're done, you should have a nice straight seam here. If you see any wiggles, that means you have a pleat on the other side and you're going to have problems with squaring it up to the right size. So make sure you have that nice straight seam. And then I usually press from the other side as well when I'm doing that. So that's it. That's how you press seam open. Let's trim this up and then we are ready to sew our rows together. So when I'm trimming, there's a few key points I look at. First of all, I line the 45-degree line of my ruler up with that seam line. Then I want to make sure There I've got fabric hanging past the edges, of course, so we have to trim that down. And that also I have fabric hanging past where I need to trim it to in order to get it to the right size that's called for in the pattern. Once I'm happy with that, I'm going to go ahead and trim on the sides. I'm right-handed, so for me that means the right and the left side. And occasionally I'll have things slip a little bit. So you can see here that this isn't going straight to the point the way I want it to, because this is the key to getting nice points, is making sure that the 45° of that seam goes right into that point. So I'm just going to do another teeny tiny little trim here just to get off that tiny little bit. And look, we're just getting a little bit off, but it makes a huge difference because now that point is going right into, or the seam is going right into that point. So I'm going to have really great joins for that. All right, so now I am flipping everything around. So the cut edge is now on the left and the bottom. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to line it up. Again, the first thing I do is I get that 45° line going exactly along that seam line. Then I'm going to line up the edge that I just cut with the exact measurement that is called for in the pattern to trim it up to. And then once I'm happy with everything, I'm going to give it a little trim. So I know we really didn't cut too much off of that. There really wasn't a ton to remove, but I want to show you how much neater it looks. And even there's a little bit of a size difference. This one hasn't been trimmed yet. This one has. And you can see it's a little smaller. It's definitely neater. We don't have those dog ears there. So it's going to be a lot easier to get everything to come together and correctly and get all your points where you want them to be when you take the time to trim. I know it's a pain, but it is essential if you want to have good points. So I'm going to go ahead and trim this one and then we'll sew some rows together. So I'm working on one of the middle rows here. It's actually smack dab in the middle of the quilt. So what I'm doing here is I have my first 2 blocks laid out there and then my next 2 there, and I already have everything else sewn together and ready to go for the next step. So why I wanted to show you this part is this is really the only seam you have to pin at all when you are putting your rows together. When you're assembling your quilt top, we'll have some more things to pin. But for right now, we really just have to make sure that these points come together, because here you've got a nice squared off corner and a point on opposite sides, and then it keeps going like that all the way down the row. So it is really a pretty fast quilt to go together because I can just flip this right sides together. Then what I like to do is kind of just line it up. I kind of look at it from the top there and look at it and make sure that everything is nice and in line with each other. So that way I can see that my points are good to go. And then I pin in the right side of that seam allowance. And that is just to hold it together until I can get it to the sewing machine. Now for this part, I'm just gonna fold this right sides together and I'm just gonna stack them up so that way I know that this is the side that I have to sew on because I already had that pin there. But otherwise, I just go. If you want to pin and you feel more comfortable doing a lot of pinning through here, by all means do it. But if you need permission not to, that's okay. You absolutely can skip the pinning for a lot of this. All right, so I am starting with that first piece that we had to pin. So really what I'm doing is I'm leaving the pin in until I get it lined up in there. I'm gonna sew a couple stitches until I get that first half of the seam allowance really tacked down. And then I always stop with my needle down because that kind of acts as a pin, and only then do I pull my pin. This is why I really don't like those feed dogs, the 1/4" presser feet, that have a guide here, because it gets in the way of really accurate pinning. So if you can get a 1/4" foot or a universal foot with a 1/4" stitch setting that doesn't have that guide, I think you're gonna be a lot happier with how your points turn out. So now I'm just gonna sew my 1/4" seam down the rest of this here. And if you're wondering what chain stitching was, you heard me talk about it before, but you didn't know, this is what it is. So what I do is I just grab my next bit. I'm gonna line up my corners because I didn't take the time to pin those because I just trimmed them and I know they're all exactly the right size. So now I just lift up my presser foot, slide the next one in, and start sewing. I do the same thing with these as I did with that scant 1/4" seam, except instead of holding my finger on the left side, I just hold it on the right side, and that helps me maintain a nice 1/4" stitch all the way to the edge. For all my seams, I'd like to press those open, so I do it the same way. You just want to kind of take care to make sure that you're not pressing any of your other seams over as you do it. One thing I should point out is your point here, you can see it ends about 1/4 inch away from your edge. That's because you still have 1/4 inch seam allowance for when you join your rows together. So if your point isn't going all the way to the edge of your fabric, that's good. It's supposed to be about 1/4 inch away and you're good to go. Another reason why I really like pressing seams open for triangles is sometimes when you press it from side to side, it will shift the look of where the point is. So even if you were perfect to start with, sometimes it looks off when you're done because of the way you press your seam, which is not good. You don't want to have that happen. Oh yeah, so I am really happy with that join. It is really good. It's about 1/4 inch away and my points are coming right where they should be. I'm really happy with this. So I'm going to keep sewing the rest of my row together, and then I'm going to show you how to join your rows so that you can maintain those perfect points as you sew. So now I'm ready to join my rows. I'm going to show you how I do this to keep these points absolutely perfect. You can see that I'm about 1/4 inch away from those points, which is perfect. We're going to be able to really dial in and get absolutely perfect pinning when we do this. So what I do first, obviously, is flip them right sides together. Then when I'm pinning these parts here, you can see right here where that triangle is coming together from the other side, where that's hitting the side. So what I'm going to do is put my pin right in where the tip of that triangle is, and then I'm going to find the same tip on the other side. Because while this should be exactly 1/4 inch away, it isn't always. And so sometimes you might not have exactly 1/4 inch seam, but I would rather be off a little bit on my seam than lose a point, because people are going to notice if your point's wrong. They're never going to know if your seam is off just a smidgen. Now I'm not talking about off by like a massive amount, but 1/8 of an inch or less, you're fine. Okay, so now holding this pin straight up and down, I take a second pin and I'm going to pin into the right side of that seam allowance. The reason why I pin into the right side is we're going to be sewing from here. So I can sew until my needle is down in this half of the seam allowance, then pull the pin and keep on going. So that's how I'm going to pin all my points whenever they're coming together. And then on this side, we just pin the exact same way when I was joining those tops. What I do here is just line those points up. I kind of look at it visually from up top and here, and then come from the side and just leave this in long enough to get started with that row and then keep on going. So go ahead and pin the rest of the way down your row, and then we're going to sew this guy together. All right, so I've got everything pinned and I'm going to start sewing here. And just like when we were doing the little pieces together, I'm going to start off with that pin in that corner just long enough to where I can get that first half of the seam allowance together and then pull the pin. That'll keep those points really nice and tidy all the way to the edge of your quilt. Then I just kind of go for it, making sure I'm keeping an accurate 1/4 inch seam. And whenever I come to a seam, I'm going to stop with my needle down in the left side of that seam allowance, the one you come to first, then pull my pin. That first one doesn't matter so much because you really don't have any points there. Now, as I come to this one, I'm going to aim for one needle width to the right of where those triangles come together. So you're on the seam side of where you can see those triangles where we did that special double pin. And again, that is because we know that those points are exactly right on top of each other. So if I sew just to the right of that, then my points are going to come together absolutely perfectly. So I've got that done, pull my needle out, and let's keep on going and just repeat that as you go all the way down. All right, so it's the moment of truth time where we get to see how these triangles turned out. So let's open it up. And I haven't pressed anything yet, but I am very happy with that. That is really going right to the corner. And this guy too is looking really good. If you ever were unhappy with a point, like say something didn't turn out exactly the way you wanted, no need to rip everything. Just rip about an inch or so on either side of the point, repin and resew just that section. Sewing a little bit before and after where you ended to help lock those stitches in. I hope this has really helped you with your points. I'm going to press this flat and show you guys what it looks like really in all its glory, with those nice pressed flat seams and everything perfectly pinned. And it just takes a little bit of extra effort, guys, to make sure that you are trimming everything to size after you're done sewing your triangles. And then with that double pinning, it really makes a huge difference in how well your triangles turn out. And then I really think pressing your seams open makes a huge difference as well. All right, so that is all you need to do to get really perfect points when you are sewing your half square triangles together. These are pretty large, so it's a really good one to practice with instead of working with teeny tiny little things. And again, everything you need to make this quilt is available at shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com. You can get the book, Simple Quilts for the Modern Home, from us, and I'll sign it if you order it from us. And then also we have this lovely fabric as well, because the original fabric is not available anymore, not all of it anyway, to make ripples. So this is Mirage from QT Fabrics, and then Ink and Arrow is their modern brand, and that is the pixie dots, which I've used for the background here. I really like this. There's a couple of different colorways in it. I kind of picked the blue and green one for this, but I just really like this pebbly look. And then there's like an animal print, and then these little splatters, and then the circles, more animal print in blue. And then in this one, it comes back to the one that we started with. So this one's really cool because it really just has those colors going in like these diagonal rows, but you put it together in just regular horizontal rows like this. But the way it goes together is really fun, really cute. We'll put up some photos of the original, but again, you can absolutely do it in any color. This is as far away from the original earth tones as you can get, and it looks really cool, and I like the way it comes together. And of course, those points are just turning out fabulously. So thank you so much for following along. If you enjoyed this video, if you want to make this quilt and you love our videos, you can support us by getting the materials you need to make it from us over at shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com, and the book as well. Thanks so much, and until next week, happy quilting.